Welcome back, everyone. We're diving deep into a conflict that's been twisting the global stage for years now. Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine, which started back in 2022. It's a mess, and there's so much to unpack.
Absolutely, it's wild how it's still raging even in 2025. What's striking to you the most?
Well, for starters, you've got Russia controlling roughly 20% of Ukraine's territory. Think the Donbas and parts of the south. Yet it's come at a brutal price. We're talking about nearly 700,000 Russian soldiers dead or wounded. It's a stark reminder that no military blitzkrieg is ever that simple.
Right. It almost feels like what was expected to be a one-week sweep turned into an endless slog. What do you reckon is keeping Putin in this stubborn nightmare?
It's like, imagine stepping into a swamp thinking it's just a kiddie pool. Putin envisioned a swift victory, taking Kiev, turning Ukraine into a puppet state, and bolstering his own image. Instead, Ukraine, led by Zelensky, doggedly resisted, and the West jumped in big time.
Yeah.
Western aid has been pouring in. Tanks, drones, HIMARS, over $65 billion actually.
That's incredible. And speaking of wild promises, I remember hearing some outlandish claims during the US election, like Trump saying he could end the war in 24 hours. How did that play into the narrative?
Oh yeah, that was something else. Trump's 24-hour claim was basically a soundbite, a bit of a half-joke really. He later suggested maybe it would take 100 days, even 6 months. His pitch was all about his special sauce, boasting connections with both Putin and Zelensky, thinking that secret charm could broker peace.
But, the reality is nowhere near that, right? The war's dragged on because neither side is willing to compromise on their non-negotiable demands.
Exactly. On one hand, Putin expects Ukraine to surrender Crimea, Donbas, and essentially forgo any NATO ambitions. On the other, Ukraine, fueled by national pride and supported heavily by the West, says, "No way, we're fighting for every inch of our sovereignty."
Right.
It's like negotiating over a whole pizza when one side only wants a slice.
I see what you're saying. The stakes are not just military, but ideological too. And then there's the domestic side. Putin's handling of internal politics plays a huge role here, doesn't it?
Oh, for sure. At home, Putin's propaganda machine is in overdrive, painting the war as a lifesaver against the so-called evil West. Polls show that around 70% of Russians buy into that narrative. But interestingly, independent studies reveal that up to 84% of Russians actually want better roads, hospitals, basically improvements at home. Yet any dissent is met with harsh crackdowns, so public opinion gets even more twisted.
So, it's like he's using the war to hold on to power, even if it means sacrificing real progress for the people.
Exactly. He's trapped between a rock and a hard place. Ending the war without a convincing win would be seen as weakness, and that's just not an option for him given his ideological stance on Ukrainian sovereignty. Meanwhile, from a broader perspective, the West's involvement makes it even more complicated.
Right, because NATO and other allies have been kind of the lifeline for Ukraine, right? But their response hasn't been without its own issues?
Correct. The West's support, billions of dollars in military aid, advanced weaponry like Javelins and Leopard tanks, has been crucial. However, there's been a lot of political infighting, especially in US Congress, that stalls some of these aid packages. And all the while, Putin bets on the possibility that the West might eventually get distracted or exhausted by all the political bickering.
But doesn't that kind of miscalculation risk everything? I mean, using disinformation tactics, even nuclear hints, seems like walking on a razor's edge.
Absolutely. His nuclear flexing is a major point, like moving tactical nukes to Belarus and tweaking nuclear doctrines. It's a clear strategy aimed at scaring the West into backing off. However, it's largely backfiring because Ukraine remains defiant and Europe's hardened its stance, especially with policies such as Germany's Zeitenwende, which pivoted them from a cozy past with Russia to robust defense spending.
And even China, which historically might have been seen as a potential ally, isn't quite buying into Putin's narrative, right?
Exactly. China's stance is more about upholding sovereignty and international norms. Putin's nuclear posturing ends up isolating him further, undermining any chance of a mutually beneficial resolution. It's a double-edged sword, intended to intimidate, but it ramps up global opposition.
So then, what about peace talks? There have been attempts at negotiations, but nothing seems to stick. Why is that?
Well, it's a trust deficit on a monumental scale. For instance, there were talks pushed by Trump's camp involving ceasefires in places like Saudi Arabia or Turkey, But Putin's approach, sending lower-level diplomats instead of personally engaging, signals a lack of genuine commitment. Meanwhile, Zelensky's stance remains that he'll negotiate only if Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity are fully respected. That's a deadlock in the truest sense.
That sounds like a classic case of both sides being too entrenched. Do you think there's any realistic scenario where Putin might finally call it quits?
It's like waiting for a miracle, a scenario where the cost of continuing the war becomes so debilitating that even Putin is forced to reconsider. He'd have to face either a severe military defeat or immense domestic backlash. But his ideological grip, this insistence that Ukraine must remain within his sphere, makes compromise nearly unthinkable. Scholars even suggest that wars end when both sides are rational enough to bargain, which frankly Putin isn't.
I get that. It's almost like a chess game where neither is willing to call a draw because the stakes are too high. And oh man, the human cost, 700,000 casualties for Russia alone, not to mention the devastation in Ukraine.
Exactly. The human and material costs are astronomical. Take, for example, cities like Avdiivka, now virtually rubble, or the nearly 700,000 refugees displaced just from the Donbas region. The war's impact stretches far beyond the front lines. It's a humanitarian crisis on top of a geopolitical stalemate.
It's humbling and horrifying. And then there's the propaganda war. 435 documented Russian influence operations targeting Western audiences since 2000, trying to sow doubt and discredit Ukraine. It's like all these pieces come together, making every move calculated.
Right, and that disinformation is a crucial part of how Putin tries to shape narratives both at home and abroad. His campaign, including all that nuclear rhetoric, isn't just bluster. It's a systematic effort to undermine support for Ukraine and even fracture Western resolve. But as we see, it's only deepening the divisions and rallying global resistance.
So, with all this complexity, the military, political, and ideological layers, it seems like we're stuck in a perpetual loop. Is there any path out of this deadlock?
That's the million-dollar question. In theory, a breakthrough might come if either Ukraine can force a military turnaround or if Putin faces insurmountable domestic pressure from a populace demanding basic services over endless conflict. But realistically, the war continues because neither side is willing to back down until their very core interests are met.
And that stalemate, in turn, drags out the suffering for civilians and the loss of life on all sides. It's a grim reminder of how geopolitical ambitions can wreak havoc on everyday lives.
Exactly. And this is why the global community must stay vigilant, not just in terms of direct military aid, but also in countering disinformation and supporting political solutions that prioritize sovereignty and human rights.
No doubt about that. The narrative we see often oversimplifies the conflict. On one side, you have Putin's grand vision of a new world order, and on the other, Ukraine's unyielding fight for self-determination. It's not a simple script with a neat ending.
For sure, it's like watching a never-ending epic where every move is fraught with political intrigue, human pain, and the shifting sands of global alliances. And let's not forget, the West has its own internal debates and challenges that sometimes muddy the waters even further. It's a multidimensional crisis.
Yeah, I totally get that. And here's a thought. While many criticize the West's sometimes hesitant approach, could it be that a more aggressive and united strategy would actually force a resolution? Or is that too simplistic?
Look, I respectfully think it's not that simple. On one hand, ramping up military support and tightening diplomatic ties could pressure Putin, but on the other, it risks escalating tensions further and might even push him toward more reckless behavior, like that nuclear posturing we mentioned earlier. So balance is key, and achieving that is easier said than done.
That makes sense. And it's a tough balancing act because any misstep could have global repercussions. Do you feel there's any silver lining or any lesson our listeners should particularly focus on?
Absolutely. The silver lining here is the underlying testament to resilience. Ukraine's fight is not just about territorial boundaries. It's about the right of every nation to choose its own destiny against overwhelming odds. And for the global audience, it's a reminder to be wary of propaganda, whether it's the overt nuclear threats or the subtle, creeping disinformation campaigns. It's about staying informed and questioning the narratives.
Well said. It's like being on guard in a world full of noise. Knowing what's real and what's spun for power plays is more important than ever.
Exactly. And while the road to peace seems endlessly complicated, the insistence on defending sovereignty and truth remains the cornerstone. As we look ahead, the hope is that eventually rationality and justice will win out, even if it means a prolonged struggle.
I appreciate your insights. It's a lot to chew on. This situation is a complex tapestry of ambitions, propaganda, and dire consequences, and every layer matters.
Right. And that's why discussions like these are crucial. They remind us that wars aren't fought solely on battlefields, but in the arenas of public opinion, international alliances, and even in the homes of everyday people affected by the conflict. Every thread in this tangled web counts.
For sure. And while we might not have all the answers, staying engaged and questioning gives us a better chance of driving change, no matter how incremental it may be.
Exactly. As we wrap up this conversation, it's important for everyone listening to remember to keep questioning, to seek the truth behind the headlines, and to support efforts that push for a fair and lasting peace for Ukraine. That's what ultimately matters.
Well, you've given us a lot of food for thought. It's been an enlightening chat, full of hard truths, and a call to stay vigilant in a world where might often seems to rule over right.
Thanks for joining in on this deep dive. Keep your eyes open, your minds sharp, and don't be afraid to challenge the narratives. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.